Hi, my name is Ian Wood, and I'm a lecturer in journalism. And I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about the rise of the digital newsroom and the work that's gone on over the last, well, more than a decade to create the industry that we see now, where converged newsrooms are the norm, where single media public publishing businesses are very much in the minority. So I just want to take you through some of my experiences and talk to you a little bit about trends within the industry right now. So I'm just going to share my screen, put myself down in the corner down there. Um, so a little bit about myself. So when I began as a reporter, I was working on a very much a print newspaper. So I started on the Newcastle Evening Chronicle before moving to the Manchester Evening News, and both of those were in pretty much entirely print, very large print circulations. Certainly, the Manchester Evening News, we were up around 200,000 newspapers being sold every day at the Manchester Evening News. But we were part of the Guardian Media Group at the time, and there was a real push towards embracing digital publishing. There was vision that the right vision that digital publishing was the future, and that our advertising was leaching off into digital, so that we should start looking ahead and preparing ourselves for a world where people sought their news elsewhere other than from a paid-for newspaper. I was the news editor and later the deputy editor at the Manchester Evening News, and I was given the job of overseeing the what was called the Convergence Project to take us from being this traditional print newsroom to being a multi-platform, digitally focused newsroom. And you can see the results of that in what the Manchester Evening News looks like right now. And we'll look at that shortly. But let me just take you through a little bit of that history. So there's the context for all of this. So I joined the Manchester Evening News in the late 90s. And so you can see at that point, things were starting to go slightly wrong in terms of print circulations. But the decline really started to grip once we got into the new millennium, and the business model of newspapers, national and regional newspapers, suddenly looked very much under threat. And you can see there, these are the national print circulations, and you'll see some of the biggest selling newspapers of their time, things like The Sun and the Daily Mail started to face some really massive declines. The Daily Mirror as well. So from huge circulations in excess of 3-4 million newspapers being sold a day, suddenly went into decline, and a lot of these businesses didn't really have an answer for that. They'd allowed digital publishers to start stealing their business, and remember that part of the money for from a newspaper organisation comes from the money that people hand over every day, but a large part of it comes from advertising revenue. So the rise of online vehicle sales, advertising, homes, small ads, all of these things started to add up. So we in the industry call these verticals. They're a number of vertical advertising markets. Property is one, motors is another. And those are absolutely key revenue generators. Jobs is another, job advertising. So as those verticals were all being taken over, and we all know of the big digital players in that market, so things like Auto Trader started to really steal the motors market. Zoopla and all of the property online estate agency ads took the property verticals. Jobs, obviously, online. I mean, when was the last time you looked for a job in a newspaper? So yeah, the business model started to crumble with the rise of digital competition. Just to stress this, just to kind of give you this sense of decline over a number of years, just over the last 20 years, you just see what's happened with print circulations. I know you know that, but it's just useful to just be aware of just the sheer scale of that decline, and really to push the point home that was bad on the nationals, but the dailies, the regional dailies, have suffered even more. That's a slightly old graph, but you can project those figures further down, and we'll look at some circulations shortly. So regional press, which was a big money spinner, so things like the Manchester Evening News, Liverpool Echo, Newcastle Chronicle, Birmingham Mail, and then even below that, the weekly newspapers. They used to generate an awful lot of money. The basic business model for newspapers used to generate about a 30% profit margin back in the heyday, and that has shrunk to very much single digits, if indeed any profit margin at all for some groups. And it's become an issue, so hopefully you'll be looking at trade press. Hold the Front Page is a good place to look for UK trade news within the media industry, certainly for the more regional level. Journalism.co.uk is a good one for national media news, and you can see stories like this which were highlighting circulation declines, print circulation declines, down by 20% in a single year. I think that was actually over a 6-month period, that particular 20% decline. So utterly unsustainable, giving the reason as to why the Manchester Evening News quite early on embraced this idea of convergence, and that soon became the model for most newspaper groups. Very few tried to hold on to their vision of a future based on print. And here's the flip side. Flip side again, the rise of digital publishing. So this one brings it right up to date from the Office of National Statistics, which shows the market share of audience using digital means to access newspapers and magazines. 2007 doesn't feel that long ago. Only 20% accessing that way, and here we are 2020, 70% of the audience is now available online, or only accessed via online, and that clearly just exacerbates that circulation decline, print circulation decline. But more importantly, because we all know about print circulation decline, it exacerbates the deterioration of the business model for newspapers, that those advertising verticals are under pressure within media companies. And of course, going along with that market share graph we saw, was having regional press, or regional and national news organisations showing massive increases in their web audiences. So no great surprise there that we're seeing rises, but it's just worth looking at it and thinking, why was this important? Why did former newspaper publishers, why were they so keen to move online when they did? Arguably very much too late. They allowed some of those big players in the vertical revenue generating sectors like motors, property, jobs. They allowed competitors to get a grip and get a foothold in those markets, and didn't respond quickly enough. So there we go. My kind of first decade at the Manchester Evening News, it was, I think it can be characterised as confusion and fear. People were worried, but people didn't really get digital, if I'm perfectly honest. Within many newspapers, they were very, very traditional, and they'd always worked really well. People were passionate about their products, people were passionate about newspapers, and they loved everything about it. In truth, they wanted to have ink on their fingers, and they wanted to produce newspapers, and so they held out and refused to accept the inevitable truth that digital was on the rise and print was on the decline. And newspaper executives were scared, didn't really know what to do, and there were quite a lot of dogmatic responses, and you saw people refusing to place content online before it had been placed into print. So print online publishing was being deliberately slowed down in order to with some misplaced view that people would buy the newspaper instead. And there was no really clear response to the very dynamic, imaginative ways that the digital advertising competitors were addressing their markets. It's not just newspapers that were challenged by this, so estate agents were being challenged as well. So we, as newspapers, used to have a very strong relationship with estate agents, and just absolute the market was absolutely disrupted by those big digital players, both for newspapers and for estate agents. And I think it's true that newspaper executives were afraid, but because they didn't quite get it, because they were not generally of a digital generation, they just copied everyone else. So we had bad practice being copied by other people in other groups. So the ideas of putting up paywalls and trying to create online page turn newspapers, all of these things were being tried around the industry, and it was simply because people didn't get digital. The people at the very tops of these groups, that these quite really bad practice was just being replicated all over the place, and it led to an awful lot of conflict. I think it's fair to say that industrial relations hit a pretty low point during that first decade of this millennium. So at the Manchester Evening News, we were embracing quite a forward-thinking view, and we overcame an awful lot of the resistance back then, some years ago now, 16 years ago. We had what was, I think, a fairly traditional model of when people were converging. They would create obviously their existing print team, and then they would create a parallel digital team. And that happened in an awful lot of places. And that's one of those bad practices I mentioned that were just being replicated. You just say, right, you're in the web team, and they would work separately, quite often in separate buildings. I know at The Guardian, because we're part of the Guardian Media Group, we used to go down to their building in Farringdon, down in London, and basically they had a separate building for their web team. And they thought that was fine, that they'd done digital by having a separate team. I was appointed as the convergence coordinator at the Manchester Evening News, and the whole point of that was to create this notion of a digital future, to step outside of that confusion and fear that I mentioned, and to try and develop a vision, a really innovative vision, which went as far as redesigning newsroom, because our newsroom was based around the old practices of print, and create whole new ways of working.